Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Microsoft Center. My name is John Frank, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event. We're here for the next in our series of presidency debates in collaboration with Euractiv and the upcoming Finnish presidency. And the topic this evening is tied to, this is EU Renewable Energy Week, and so we're going to be talking about the sustainability and energy, how to power today's world with tomorrow in mind. At Microsoft, we've become one of the leading consumers of electricity in Europe. And we've been thinking for some time about how to invest in energy so that we can have clean energy, not just for ourselves, but for broader society. So we're deeply committed to the climate accord and doing as much as we can. We have 4 principles I just briefly mentioned. Using more clean energy every year. Our goal is to use more energy to power our data centers and operations with a goal of topping 60% this year. And supporting new clean energy projects. Wherever we operate, we work to bring new clean energy online through investments and partnerships. We support public policies that make renewable energy more available and affordable in markets where we operate. And we're testing and investing in technologies that have the potential to make electric grids around the world greener, smarter, and more resilient. And so thank you for being here. I'm going to turn over to Brian McGuire, who will be our Master of Ceremonies this evening. Brian.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Thank you all for coming this evening. I appreciate that the weather could have tempted you to barbecues or football and beer in the park, so we appreciate your time here. We're going to do a little different this evening. We're going to have a quick fireside chat without the fire, because that'll be bad for the climate, with our dignified guest this evening. Then we'll have the panel discussion afterwards, and we'll have Q&A with you as well during that. So we really appreciate your questions and your comments during the course of the evening. Afterwards, we'll have a networking reception afterwards, courtesy of Microsoft. So let me invite Leo Savanbach. He's the Mertens Councillor, permanent representation of Finland to the EU. And as you may be aware, the Romanian presidency is coming to a close, and Finland is taking over. Leo has agreed to tell us all the secrets of the Finnish presidency ahead of the meeting in Helsinki this week. So, Leo, climate in Finland is something we would, 2 elements we would instinctively put together, but for the presidency, what should we be expecting? What's the general framework of your priorities for action this next 6 months?
Well, thanks, Brian. Thanks for Euractiv and Microsoft for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. Indeed, it's less than 2 weeks for the Finnish presidency, and the Prem Rep is full of people doing all the finalizing work. Hopefully, we'll be ready on the 1st of July. The presidency program, as some of you might know, we have a new government, a very ambitious government when it comes to the climate issues, and of course, this influences our presidency priorities as well. I can probably give away here, although the presidency program is still being debated tomorrow in Helsinki by our ministers, that the climate, of course, is one of the 3 key themes for our presidency, and we'll do our best to facilitate all the work that is going on at the EU level at the moment.
What else? What are the other priorities for the presidency?
Well, the other priorities I have to keep still under the lid for now, but climate is definitely one of them.
Okay. Climate can't really be separated from the economy these days as well. And the Commission's been ambitious in terms of presenting what we should be doing. Do you think it's possible to decouple climate from Europe's growing economy, or the need to grow the economy?
Yeah, and probably we shouldn't even try to decouple those. In fact, I don't think it's possible, but I think we shouldn't even do that. I think it's very much interlinked with all the industrial policy and growth agenda we have at the EU level. So keeping them closely linked is key, I think, to meet all the targets for 2030 and also for 2050.
But what does it mean to link in this case? We can have ambitious targets, but how do we achieve those, and how do you tie climate action to a growing economy?
Well, I think all the EU policies, in fact, this is a good week for many reasons for this debate here on climate, because you might know as well that the EU leaders are on Thursday and Friday debating the climate issue in the Europa building just around the corner from here, and of course discussing the vision for the EU for the 2050 from the 2050 point of view. And of course, if you have ambitious targets like for Finland, in our government program we've set a target of 2035 climate neutrality, and that's a vision, of course, for Finland. And you were asking before this meeting, you were asking if we have details on that, and also some of the panelists was asking, and I said I don't know, and I think we don't know in Helsinki yet. We're still detailing that. We had high ambition before, and now we're even going higher. And of course that means that all the sides of the society, of the economy, of all the people, everything that we do must be done a bit differently. And when it comes to the EU level, I think we have a lot of policies, a lot of regulation now in place for 2030, and we need to continue that work. We feel at the Perma, and the Finnish government feels that the Commission has done a very good work together with the Council and of course with the EP, setting the energy union in place, and I think it's been one of the key successes, and of course now let's see what happens with the long-term vision. But of course all the EU regulation, all the legislation, all the financial instruments and so on need to be linked with what we're planning to do with the climate policy.
And if we're looking at the 2050 target for carbon neutrality, it's going to cost about 520 billion euros a year. How are we going to get that kind of cash?
The 520 billion euros is an amount I cannot understand, I cannot perceive. It's a good question, of course, and I think when it comes to the MFF negotiations, the multi-financial framework that we're now discussing for the next 7 years, I think that's one of the instruments, of course, supporting all the innovation that goes into climate-friendly policies, technologies, and so on. I think the percentage, let's see where the percentage for climate finance, let's put it that way, settles. And also when it comes to the European Investment Bank and so on, so there's a lot of push for increased investment and finance into climate action. So hopefully the money will start to come.
Do you see a need for government action, for European governments to incentivize climate finance, or is this something that you think if there's money there to be made, the market should do this regardless?
I think both. A bit of a boring reply maybe, but definitely you need both of them. And I think in Finland, and I think at the European level, we've seen that with the emission trading scheme, for example. In the beginning, you needed a lot of government push, a lot of regulation. But at the moment when the prices are going up for emitting, now the market starts to function a bit better, so you need both, definitely. And the markets are, of course, I think we want to enable the markets to function better.
Markets need data. I was reading through some Microsoft briefing papers in this, and one of my favorite phrases from it was actionable intelligence. And the point was made that we don't have enough data sets which can produce the kind of results that we need. Do you think this is going to be a challenge, not just for the presidency, but for Europe over the coming years, to create actionable intelligence which can not just drive finance, but really achieve change?
That's a very tough question. Of course, we need right data to make the right decisions, but that is a bit of a question I cannot really give you a good reply.
In Finland, what drives the agenda in Finland? How are the decisions taken in a clear, transparent way, which is measurable then?
Well, for example, now that we had, before this current government, we had a climate neutral target by 2040, now we're going to 2035. My understanding is that there has been a very strong discussion, multi-stakeholder platform discussions on how to achieve this, what should we do, and then proceed from there. And I think you cannot, again, the government shouldn't think that they know everything by themselves, or the civil servants. I think we need all the NGOs like we have here as well. We need all the politicians, not only from the government parties, and then we need consumers. We need just regular people as well presenting themselves, be it cyclists or whatever. So kind of pooling and sharing and trying to get a better picture of what to do.
And one of the headline figures is that we have 12 years to cap global warming at 1.5%. You feel the urgency? Does Finland feel the urgency?
I feel the urgency personally very much. I was posted in China, in fact, before coming to Brussels. I was in Beijing for 3 years, and I felt the urgency. And I think the Chinese started to, and the Beijing Ren started to feel the urgency as well in Beijing, feeling that it's not only smoke, it's really it's a bad issue for them, and definitely you've seen the climate strikes or all this movement in the grassroots, and then also the youth showing that we need to really, the current generation needs to preserve the planet for them as well, and there's really an urgency. And but as I said, I think the current commission has been putting the balls into movement, and we need to kick them forward and make good decisions. Yeah,
it's fine for Europe to make ambitious targets. If China doesn't go along with that, then there's a big gap in that policy process. How do the Chinese, as such a global player in the climate markets, how do they see this problem unfolding, and how do they see the solutions to this?
Well, I think they see the societal movement that is asking for a change. Having lived in China, you can see that it's a really it's a nationwide issue. It's not only Beijing, it's not only the cities in the north, it's all around. The big blanket moves around over China, and of course it's a big global issue as well. And I think for being a legitimate, ruler of China, also the Communist Party saw that we need to find a solution for this. Otherwise, there will be not support for this rule. So, and of course, they see, okay, this is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Now we start investing, we make people happy, but also we gain new markets, and we have new products to sell on the global market. And I think the same logic applies for European Union as well.
When it comes to solving the climate crisis, do you trust engineers or politicians to get this done?
I think we wouldn't have this vision of 2035 if you would ask the engineers in Finland. So personal opinion, so probably you need both again. You need high ambition, a leap of faith, which the politicians are better at doing. And then, of course, you need the hard data, you need the experts on the side to kind of plan all this.
And just as you describe those different elements, it seems like learning a language in some ways. Are we becoming more literate with climate initiatives, or becoming more literate with the sense of what needs to be done? Or is the populist tinge that the climate deniers, those who deny science in general, how do you see the balance moving? Is it for those who are more fact-based or those who are more emotional-based?
I think there's definitely more information when it comes to private people as well. What is the impact of my personal, things, if I eat meat, or if I use car, or if I use rail or train, or rail or plane or whatever. So you have more information on the carbon footprint you leave. But also, again, I think there's people who, out of principle, are against or for, these type of actions, and which is not me, but I understand also these people, and then, yeah.
This is the
it's hard to say, but I think if you look, it's also getting a lot easier for individuals and consumers to be more climate friendly, more environment friendly, and I think, being a bit blunt, I think the easiness for humankind to make something really easy for people, that's key.
Okay. It's going to be your job to persuade perhaps the unpersuadable elements of the European Union that necessary action, faster action has to happen. Without picking any individual countries, member states, where do you see the bottlenecks in terms of process for achieving strong climate change in policy over the next 6 months?
Well, I think there's clearly a lot of movement towards higher ambition. All the member states understand that we need to do our bit. We need to show leadership.
Solidarity, you mean?
We need to also show solidarity, because solving these issues, reaching the 1.5 degree target, for example, it will not come easy. And it will affect the European Union and different member states and different regions within the member states differently. And of course we have tools for this, and these are the tools I think they're discussing on Thursday and on Friday at the European Council with the heads of state. So they're trying to figure out what are the conditions, but what are also the tools that we can use in order to make sure that there's a just transition for everyone. And that's key as well from the Finnish government point of view.
Let's welcome back to this just transition in terms of employment in a moment, but in terms of migration as well. It's not, we don't often make the link between climate change and migration policy in Europe as well. Do you think that's something that's going to be on the radar this time, when you have to persuade hesitant member states that being more ambitious on climate will actually translate to a long-term migration policy as well?
I think that should be one of the elements, and I think that is one of the elements, and especially from our point of view, definitely also supporting African countries fighting climate change is key when you try to manage the migration flows, and I think from the financial point of view, there's a lot of movement on this front as well to support them.
And on the employment, President Macron, he suffered when he went, in my opinion at least, too quickly with taxes on fuel. And those who were perhaps least able to afford it rebelled for this reason, and perhaps some others as well. How does the Finnish presidency, how does Europe now bridge this gap between climate change and employment and the risk that it presents to the weakest in society?
Yeah, I think on this we need better information, but we need also more information and better communication. And when you mention data, I think we still don't understand the effects of climate change. We still don't understand well enough the effects of policy choices we make here and how that will impact individual people, individual cities and so on. And I think people are afraid of the change a bit, and that we need to, of course, solve as well. But I don't have a better answer to your question than that.
Olli Rehn, who you may be familiar with,
yeah.
He was often criticized for looking at the spreadsheet and not the human cost of austerity policies, for example. Do you think we risk making the same mistake when it comes to climate? Is that we're looking for the most efficient approach to climate management at the cost, the personal cost of those who may be left behind in this process? And just to add on to that, would you think it's perhaps acceptable to have a less efficient market to ensure our democracy is held more firmly together?
Well, I think it's really a painful process to keep in mind all the time the people that are affected by the policy choices we make here. And of course, looking at the spreadsheets and only on the data and on the hard economic data, that would be a mistake. Personal opinion. I think if you look at the Finnish election results, for example, you had Greens gaining quite a lot, but the biggest opposition party was partly gaining because of all that they said the climate fuss we have in Finland. So you need to manage this, of course, and show people that we can make a change. We need to make a change, but what are the tools and how do we do it together?
Just to close, in Finland, what's the lesson that's been learned in terms of how you make that change? How do you bridge this gap?
Yeah, well, it's a good comment, and I think in that sense we haven't done enough. But I think we need to support the individual choices even more. It's not only you need to bring the decisions close to the people and the impacts, and show that when you do your individual decisions, you can make a change.
So
it starts from that.
So not just investing in climate change, but making sure the individual is invested in climate change.
You
as well.
just don't talk about about the energy production and so on, but bring the climate change close to the human being, close to the individual, and then they start to understand how they can change.
Thank you so much for taking time with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure. Good luck with the presidency.
Thank you.
We can rearrange our chairs just a moment, and I'll introduce the rest of our panelists. While we're doing that, any questions you want me to put to the panel from the very beginning? Let's see. One more, I think. Two more. If you have a question you want to kick off with, just raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone. Yeah, we got one? Thank you. Okay, let's pull this back a little bit. Okay, tell us who you are, where you're from, and your question. We'll open with your question, okay?
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Nadia Allen from MCHEMEU. My question sort of stems off what you were just talking about, having individuals invested in the transition. But it's more to know maybe what Finland is doing or what policymakers can do to further encourage or incentivize consumers to really acknowledge the change. Not that it's hugely being acknowledged by consumers and individuals, but how to collectively incentivize and encourage society to really be on board with the transition, because we don't want anybody to get left behind.
Thank you. Okay, I'll invite our panelists to come and take a seat. Can you just remind us who's in which order for the microphones, please? Thank you. I think Esther's beside me, then Bernd. Sorry, just to make sure our technician get this right. Yeah, Bernd, just here. Great. Okay, please help yourself to some water there. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Beside me is Esther Mollendorf. She's climate justice and energy campaigner, Friends of the Earth Europe. Very welcome. Representing the distinguished European Commission is Bernd Weerwert. He's deputy head of cabinet of Commissioner Maros Sefcovic, European Commission. They're leading the resistance against Brexit in the United Kingdom, but also Green MEP Molly Scott-Cato. Follow her on Twitter, ladies and gentlemen. The fight back goes on. And beside Molly, we have Victoria Karelska. She's the head of advocacy and messaging at Wind Europe, and also our resource, which we're going to hear about a little bit too. And from Hungary, we have Benedikt Javor, current MEP, though not returning for the next session, but he'll be back again after that, I think. It's great to have you all here with us this evening. So let's start with this. First of all, let me ask you to introduce yourselves. Just 60 seconds, who you are, what your thing is, and your key message. Esther.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Esther. I work for climate for Friends of the Earth Europe. So my issue is mainly bringing forward the energy transition through developing the influence that people can have in this energy transition. So it's developing energy communities. My organization is campaigning also for an fossil-free Europe by 2030. So we think that Europe needs to get rid of fossil fuels quickly in the next 10 years. That people need to have a strong role in bringing the alternatives through these energy communities, and that people also need to be taken into account as regards energy poverty and working against that.
Thank you, Esther. Bernd.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Brian told me that he's going to cut me off with the latest Microsoft technology after 60 seconds. You know, for a commission official,
He's ready to speak for 30 minutes.
For a commission official, it's very difficult to speak in 60 seconds. Well, I work currently for the Vice President of the European Commission in charge of Energy Union. So this, as you know, has been a new portfolio, working across many sectors to work for climate-friendly, forward-looking energy and climate policy. We've been working a lot, notably on the regulatory framework, including the Renewables Directive you've been mentioning in your invitation, but also on the enabling framework, which is very much looking into issues how to incentivize investments, an issue I'm sure it's going to come up during the discussion. For us, what has been extremely important is also to make sure that this is not only in terms of what we are preparing in legislation, a one-off event, but that also member states take it off. And it's very timely what we are discussing today, because we were just presenting our analysis on the national energy and climate plans to implement actually the energy union governments, and to make sure that collectively we reach the targets, the different targets we've been setting out.
That was very well done, Brian. I appreciate it greatly.
2 minutes.
Who's counting? Molly.
So I'm the Member of Parliament for South West England, and that's the bit that sticks off the bottom of my country into the sea, and it's very windy, and it's also apparently the best place on the planet to make solar energy, because of the incidence of the sun. Don't ask me, it's an engineer's problem, not a politician's one. But basically we have a real advantage in renewable energy, and that's how I came into this conversation, because I want to see that potential turned into jobs and into money and economic success in my region, and I've been battling a government which has basically been withdrawing support for renewables. Then on this side, I have two stakes here really. I've worked a lot on the sustainable finance agenda, so I'm interested in how you create the incentives for investment to flow in this direction, and also how you take investment away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. I'm also for the 2030 target. And I'm also interested in agriculture, again linking back to my region, which is a very agricultural region, and thinking about how we can actually capture carbon back from the atmosphere through the way we manage land, not only through tree planting, which I think is probably big in the Finnish plan, but also through improving the quality of our soils, so having carbon-rich soils, reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Thank you. Victoria.
Yes, thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. So I'm Victoria. I'm coming from a very small country, Bulgaria, but I'm representing a big industry, and I'm very happy about it, because the European wind industry is a great success story of the European Union. We are technology leaders, and we are ensuring that also the European Union remains a technology leader worldwide. We provide many jobs in every single member state in the European Union. And we have also had a very positive result in cutting down the costs of our energy, so that we can deliver the energy transition at the lowest cost possible. So in order for us to continue with this very positive track in the next decades, the main thing that I would like to talk to you today about is how we plan for the future, because planning for the future starts today. As we've heard previously, we now have 2030 national and energy climate plans that all the member states presented to the Commission, and that will be the bedrock of how we do the energy transition. So in there, I would like to talk about the key policy measures that would need to be included in them, and also to talk about new business models that can also incentivize renewables going forward in the next decade, such as, for instance, corporate renewable power purchase agreements.
Thank you, Victoria. Benedict.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm a member of the European Parliament, Vice Chair of the Committee for Environment and Green Coordinator for the Industry and Energy Committee, and I was one of the key negotiators of the elements of the clean energy package in the last couple of years. I have four basic messages for today. The first, that in spite of the ambitious elements of the clean energy package, where we are in Europe and where we are in globally is very, very, very far from being enough to keep climate change on a manageable level and to meet with the requirements of the Paris Agreement. The second, that the change we need must be a completely cross-cutting, transformative change. We shouldn't concentrate simply on energy sector, but also agriculture, urban and spatial planning, transport, and so on and so forth. The third, and it was already mentioned, that why we must be effective and successful in business and technological terms. Also, we have to be successful in social terms as well. No one can lag behind, being it a social groups or groups of member states in the European Union. And the fourth is about financing, and mostly the question which I meet is that where the money comes from. I believe that the money is already there, just we are spending it in a bad way. Europe is spending €1 billion a day to import gas from Russia. So the 500 billion euros, which was mentioned before, it's almost there, just paid for Russia for gas. This must be changed in the future.
Thank you, Benedict. Excellent. Molly, just to come to the question, we're going to talk a lot about high-level stuff and investments, the big game stuff, but without the support of the individual citizens, this isn't going to move very far at all. How do we invest our citizens and how do we educate our citizens to make the changes which are clearly necessary in society?
Well, I think we've got bad news for citizens and good news.
Oh, great.
So the bad news is, if we don't do this, human civilization is at risk. And, you know, I was there when they launched the Extinction Rebellion in Parliament Square, Halloween last year. And the first demand of Extinction Rebellion is tell the truth. And if you look at the IPCC report, the truth is stark. We have 11 years now to deal with climate change before it gets into a runaway pattern where we have melting of permafrost, you know, release of methane, etc., and then we won't be able to deal with it. So during this Parliament's mandate, we're going to use up half that time. So we really have to focus our minds. And I think actually most citizens are aware of that. That's certainly been my experience, and what they're looking for is political leadership. So I think we need to be completely clear. No pussyfooting around, no more space for climate denial, no more political prevarications. Unity of purpose is the first thing. But then on the other side, the message is actually very positive, because what we're talking about is a Green New Deal. We're talking about a major investment in a sustainability transition, talking about good quality jobs and jobs in every community. These aren't jobs that can be exported. You know, if we're talking about a large-scale program of home insulation, which I think we should be, we've got a triple win there. We're creating jobs in every community, so you know, we can offer that to citizens. Then we're also making their houses warmer, so we stop old people dying in the winter. I mean, that's a scandal in my country and no doubt in yours. And then on the other hand, we're also reducing climate emissions. So to me, the transformation we're going to undergo is going to improve people's lives. And people often talk about sacrifices, but I'm completely unconvinced by that. We are undergoing major transformation, but it's going to change the way we do things, not take things away from us. For example, we will continue to have mobility, but we may borrow a car or travel by a hydrogen bus rather than having our own personal car. And I think that's, you know, I think we have to bring citizens with us on that imaginative journey about the fact that there is going to be major change. And of course, as a politician, you know, the first reaction to change is often, no, thank you. But there is an awful lot of positive opportunity in that change as well. And I think we have to do that in a dialogue and be very clear. But my own view, what happened from the Extinction Rebellion, I'll just finish with this, is that people had been scared alone in their homes in private, and they were so relieved to find people were actually telling the truth about this. They know how big this problem is, and they just want to see that there's a clear plan to deal with it.
Thank you, Molly. Bernd, in the Commission, are people scared, alone, and afraid to express their views, or do they have... do you see that the Commission is moving in the right direction with its communication on energy policy? And in the last 5 years, what kind of change have you noticed in terms of what the citizen demands from Europe?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we started with a new portfolio construction, which very much goes into the direction what you have been saying, that we have to look cross-sector. I mean, previously, I see it's a very young audience, so many will not remember that we had a very antagonized intra-commission system, basically, where you had the Director General of Climate fighting against the DG Energy and Enterprise. And I think with this new approach of having kind of project teams and to look beyond, I mean, transport sector, housing, research, or agriculture was mentioned. I think this was the right approach, and this has been also seen. I mean, when we've been going out, I mean, we've been doing a lot of citizens dialogues. I mean, you know, the new regulatory approach also on stakeholder consultation, a lot also for hours with youth. I mean, we've been very much encouraged by this. Certainly, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, you mentioned in your invitation IPCC, there's certainly some sense of urgency, and the message, I think, is understood by many. Physically, directly, I mean, if you look at last year's summer, for example, but also, I mean, I like to cite this example. It makes, I mean, many people ask you, I mean, why the hell 2 degree or 1.5? I mean, what the hell makes it a difference? And I like this example, I mean, of the doctor who says it makes a difference if you have fever 41.5 or 43. With 43 you are dead. So I mean, I think all of us have to see this sense of urgency, but at the same time don't see it as a threat, but as an opportunity. And I think we've been a lot also talking about this narrative that the decoupling of cutting CO2 emissions and growth is possible. But I think also that in the next mandate we have to look much more also in, I mean, how we define growth, because we are encountering more and more also not only the limit of growth, but also the growth of limits. If we are looking how our economy is working, we have to look much more into bioeconomy, circular economy. So I think it's also a new notion of competitiveness. But in the end, realizing that this decoupling is possible, that it's providing jobs, it's providing also a much better life in cities in Beijing and Brussels. So I think this is a huge opportunity. The last thing I wanted to say, if I compare 5 years ago when we started, I was looking a bit also at the policy documents, and nowadays it was mentioned the European Council conclusions. Hopefully the paragraph 4 will get some tough message on Thursday. At the same time, the European Council is discussing its strategic agenda, priorities for the next years. Chapter 3 is a lot about what we are discussing today. I think this gives a lot of hope, and hopefully also the new European Parliament will give a push that we can continue along this path.
Thank you, Brian. Benedict, I want just to draw on some of that. And from your perspective as an MEP, and over the last 5 years as well, do you see the Commission moving towards less of a siloed approach? And is climate going to cut across all of the portfolios in the next Commission?
Well, the attempt I see, absolutely, and during the negotiations of the clean energy package, already we had this approach that the social justice issue, also that the energy communities should be in the heart of the energy transition, and this was widely accepted and supported by the Commission. Also, there were some efforts to include to the energy transition much more than before the different sectors, including transport, agriculture, forestry, and so on and so forth. But still, I see the difficulties. So still there are the DGs, still the DGs sometimes they are fighting against each other. And it's not only on the level of the DGs, but at the level of the national governments as well, very often. Simply the success criteria for some parts of the national governments or the EU institutions are contradictory to the success criteria for other parts of the governments or EU institutions. And it's very difficult to reunify those approaches and to find the common understanding that what is the problem and how should we act together, as there is a different goal for
Where do you see the
transport.
key problems? For example, here is 3% budget deficit a problem for financing green finance in the future? Or do we really need to rethink the whole of our system?
If you don't mind.
Sure.
I think we need to be relaxing those limits specifically for these kind of sustainability investments. I mean, it just makes no sense at all to say we can't afford to save ourselves. You know, the British Chancellor said that recently, and I just think it's completely absurd. I mean, we make the rules around money. Money is a social construct. We're talking about floods, heat waves, physical things that we cannot change, but we can change money. And so I think we need to really think about the fact that we are prohibiting governments from making investments for their citizens now that would prevent the catastrophes we're looking at in the future, merely because we've invented some straitjacket around the Eurozone.
Who would you go? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe adding on to that, so on the investment needs and gap which is there, I clearly agree also with what Benedict said, that the money is there. We just need to put it into the right sort of budget lines to be able to finance this energy transformation. And one of the big sort of pots that I see is tax avoidance, tax evasion. So we have no corporate income tax, no common rules for corporate income tax in the EU for the time being. So that means you've got companies going to Luxembourg, Ireland, Belgium, and paying peanuts in tax, but making big profits. So and there's no redistributional effect there anymore. So that money is gone for the collective good. The Commission starts, so member states starting to get annoyed about this. The Commission talks about it. I think there's definitely a window of opportunity for this new Commission, for the new Parliament, to work on that issue and to work then. So what are the rules that we need actually to make these decisions on taxes to happen? So that's the unanimity rule in the Council, which needs to be changed. And
So, but this is desperately hard to achieve. And even if you got the regulatory framework in place, your actual capacity to draw that money back into the EU budget or national budgets even is going to be incredibly difficult. So is it not easier to reorganize the financial system for green finance and by softening the deficit requirements, things like that?
I think it needs both, but because I come back to tax issues, because I think there's also these taxation sort of really influence the way we do things. So flying to the other end of Europe every weekend for 30 years is possible because there is no aviation fuel tax. It's absurd. Today, this is absurd. This should not exist. So, and again, I see a window of opportunity because there are member states, governments. There's in Sweden, there's this shaming, fly shaming or fly shaming, which has been, in the air, there's other governments. France has been talking about taxation, taxing aviation fuels. The Netherlands, Belgium. So I think there's an opportunity there, and I think linked to this, then other taxation issue on corporate income tax.
But that money goes back into national budget, where it'll disappear for education, defence, for healthcare, something else. So how do you ring fence that, Molly?
Well, if you want some more on finance, because this really is my bag, but I think one of the things is that we need to turn the EIB into a climate bank. I mean, it's a public bank. This is clearly the overwhelming public priority. Sorry, I'll look this way as well. And so, you know, we need to make sure that the EIB stops any funding for fossil fuel investments that lock in fossil dependency after, say, 2030 as a last possible date. And then we need to make sure that they issue specific green bonds. And I would also argue that we need action from the ECB as well. So, for example, the ECB doesn't make any strictures over how banks lend money. It controls those banks, but the banks can lend all those money into sort of gambling circuits. It doesn't have to lend it into the real economy even. And I personally would argue for credit guidance, so the ECB said 40% of your lending has to be, or some proportion, large proportion, has to be for climate investments and
Green QE?
And Green QE, indeed. Thank you, I'd just forgotten that one by Green QE. So the ECB has basically sent, I think it was 90 billion a month, wasn't it, at one stage, huge amounts of money out into the European economy by buying corporate bonds. But a lot of the corporate bonds it bought were from fossil fuel companies. This was completely crazy. It could have been, buying green bonds, so that money then had to be invested in the green economy. So there's a lot more we could do on the finance side. What I'm saying now is a bit more radical than most people would go for, but to me, we need to go the whole way.
I want to bring to Victoria on the industry side as well. Resource, tell us a little bit about Resource, first of all, the organization.
I actually wanted to make a couple of points because
Sure.
I think quite a lot of things were mentioned here, but when we're talking about finance without being the biggest expert on it, I think in any case, in the way that the European Union is spending its public money, it definitely needs to be Paris compatible in terms of how we finance energy infrastructure going forward. And I also think we need to bear in mind the bigger context in here, because we're in a global race for investments as European Union compared also to international markets. And the extent to which we manage to keep the domestic market vibrant is also the way that we will attract this investment coming here in the European Union. And I'm saying this because previously we mentioned a little bit, about competitiveness, and we need a new definition of competitiveness. I would very much agree with that, in the sense that we definitely have the opportunity here to be an example of how we lead the energy transition worldwide. We have the technologies in the European Union, we have the experience, we have the policies in place that now need to be implemented also on how we do your power markets transition. So if we manage to use this in our advantage, I think that there is definitely a lot that we can contribute in generally how we do the energy transition at the global level. And I think a very big priority for us for the next Commission would also be what is this industrial strategy for Europe that you're going to do so that we continue to be a global leader in renewables. And this also brings me back just very briefly on the national plans that we were talking a little bit earlier, because in there you also have a pillar on competitiveness that the member states were supposed to fill in with concrete ideas on what they want to do in there. And when we were reading through all the plans, actually there were only 3 member states that fill in some details, and that definitely link the energy transition to the opportunity that it brings to attract investments, to bring jobs to local economies. And these were France, Denmark, and Spain, and nobody else. And that is very worrying.
Okay, and just come to Bernard in a second. And Resource, what is this organization?
Yes, so Resource is it's an organization that Wind Europe, together with other colleagues from the solar industry. So we have launched it already 2 years ago, and this is essentially a platform which is bringing together buyers and producers of wind energy. So this is about how you incentivize power purchase agreements in corporate renewables, and these are bilateral agreements. So essentially, a big ICT company like Microsoft, if they want to procure their electricity for their data centers directly from a wind farm, they can do so by this bilateral contract. And that's exactly what they have been doing in Ireland and also in the Netherlands. They're essentially powering their power centers directly through wind energy. Why is this very advantageous? Is because essentially you are locking the price also of wind energy for a certain amount of years. It's a fixed price. So you're essentially not exposed to any risks on it. And as I was mentioning previously, given the fact that wind energy is today the cheapest source of new power generation, it's actually very also advantageous, I think, to big power consumers also to procure their electricity, but also to set the pace.
Thank you. Bernard, then I want to talk just a little bit about transparency and the digital side of this as well.
Just a couple of words from my side on investments. I mean, you've already pointed out the huge investment needs, investment gaps, but I think it's more than manageable. I mean, on the one side, of course, we need to continue with public investment, which has also a signaling, of course, a side. If you look what we've been now doing also with the MFF, talking now about the EU with the 25% climate mainstreaming, I mean, you might argue it's not enough, but you always have to look also to the past. So there is some progress on this. If you go into some of the sectorial instruments, or policy areas, I mean, take Horizon Europe, it's even 35% climate mainstreaming. Take the Juncker Fund, Invest EU now under MFF, at least 30%. And then if you look how you can leverage it with the private sector, I mean, I'm not a banking expert. I always when I hear the leveraging factors our people from ECFIN are playing with, I say, wow, I would like to use this for my small investments. So there's a huge potential. If you look at how the Juncker Fund has been used, I mean, there was a huge interest, particularly in energy infrastructure, climate projects. I mean, I've been looking up at some estimations. You are much more knowledgeable in the sustainable financing, but I found a figure. I mean, I looked at this figure, and I have, like Leo, a little bit problems to envisage the zeros. I mean, people are saying that there's something like, if you look at institutional investors, something like 100 trillion. Even don't know how many zeros there are out there, which are looking to be invested or reinvested. So there's a huge potential, but it needs some signaling to be done. Signaling also in the sense of predictability, transparency, which you want to discuss, like with the governance, and then of course that we are trying to set some criteria for sustainable financing. Green bonds have been already mentioned. You know that we are working also with an expert group on taxonomy, on issues like disclosure, benchmarks. So to guide. The last word I want to say from my experience now in the 4 or 5 years, also in the cabinets, there is a huge interest among investors. Many people are looking to Europe. I think we are often good to criticize ourselves, but there's a huge interest. What we are doing, that we are trying to provide signals, and that you can also make money with this in sustainable financing. I mean, go also to Norway. If you look, they are drawing out now, also of the fossil fuels world, and of course we have to act now, as you said, to avoid the locking into certain technologies and energy mix.
5 years ago, I interviewed Vice President Timmermans about the Juncker plan and the leverage capital, and I put to him that this was perhaps voodoo economics and maybe it wasn't going to work. It's worked, I have to say, from my opinion at least. and now we can consider doing the same thing for the Green Deal. But what he said, I spoke to the U.S. ambassador at that moment as well. And he said, look, American money is ready to be invested, but they're not looking for a big policy plan. They're looking for individual projects. They want to invest in projects, not plans. How do you see, you see Alexander Ocasio-Cortez in America talking about Green Deal. How do you see Europe's Green Deal attracting investment? Do we need a big plan or do we need clear projects?
I come back to what Leo mentioned the introductory speech at both. And I think that the individual projects will be there and there will be money for the individual projects if there is a clear visionary project, a framework for a strategy for Europe. And the investors need a stable environment to invest into renewable energy.
And the difference this time is the subprime financial crisis was caused by lack of transparency.
Yeah.
Are we now in the age of transparency, and will this lead to greater investment security?
Yeah, but I think that the renewable energy sector is quite transparent, so I don't see any kind of bubbles in this sector. We must keep this transparency alive in the future. But really, the stability in regulation, this predictability is essential. It's much more important for the investors, and I had contacted a number of big financial investors like BNP Paribas and GE Capital and so on and so forth. And they are not looking for public money for the projects. They're not looking for subsidies. The only thing they really want to know that what we agree on targets, on regulation will be there in 5 years, in 10 years, and they can predict what is going to happen in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So that's important. But still, I have to mention, to come back to the previous issue in the discussion, that, yeah, the Juncker plan worked out in a way, but still Europe is financing a lot of fossil energy projects. And if you check the PCI list, the project of community interest, for example, it's 95% fossil energy infrastructure. It's gas, 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 and some electricity, pipelines, LNG terminals, and so on and so forth. So still, what is functioning in Europe, in the European financial scheme, is still a huge part of it is still invested in fossil energy infrastructure. And I think that this must be stopped, because before we start to spend money on renewables and energy efficiency, which is really needed, we have to stop to spend money on fossil energy. And the last issue, that when we were talking about here on taxation, normally it was like saying that we have to collect money to finance renewable energy or climate-friendly investment. But I think that we should go deeper, and when we are talking about the green taxation reform, is not only to gather money, to collect money for sustainable investment, but it's really to tax the unsustainable activities, economic activities, being it resource use or emissions or things like that. And that's a real green taxation reform. The question is not if we are able to collect money to finance something from public money, but if we are able to make the investors to pay for all the environmental damages they are doing.
Okay, I want to take questions now in just a moment. But Esther, any comments to
Yeah.
touch mine?
Maybe going back to the targets and to the sort of the regulatory framework that we need, NECPs, which have been commented today by the Commission. We as Friends of the Earth did an analysis, a very specific analysis on what do energy communities play, what kind of role do they play in these NECPs. So we have this governance regulation and renewables directive revised last year, which put then a specific space for energy communities. And now we want to see, so how is this translated in these national energy and climate plans? And we've seen that that's not really. Member states still have to understand what are these energy communities, how can they work, how can they function, what are their needs. But we've seen some champions, we've seen some laggards. And
who's good at it?
Yeah, good at it is Greece, interestingly. Greece, you can see that they've done a whole reflection about So what is the governance of an energy community? Who can sit in it? Who can be involved in it? Who should not be involved in it? What are the sort of simplifying procedural and administrative procedures that we want to put in place? And most specifically, or most importantly, a target for installed capacity by energy communities. So this is really, this is the biking lane. Here you can move onwards. We've got a target, and we have a vision. We know where we're going.
In Greece, what does the energy community look like? What is it?
I think it would look like an energy community in Belgium or in Germany. So from the government's point of view, sitting on the board, you can sit on the board municipalities, local actors, citizens, small businesses, but you should not have.
And is there an obligation for government to listen to them or not?
To the communities.
Yeah.
It's an obligation for the government to put in place regulatory frameworks which will enable them to develop. So that's an obligation for the government. That's what the governance regulation says, and what they should. This exercise they had to do it now in the NECPs. So just illustrating, if you have some regulatory incentives or regulation in place. This should allow you to make progress. And I wanted to jump back now here on what Commissioner Cañete said earlier today, on the recommendations, where he's sort of recommending that we all agree we need ambitious targets so that we can bring this energy transition forward. So we need ambitious renewables targets, ambitious efficiency targets, and ambitious greenhouse gas targets. But I've seen lacking a bit this ambition with Commissioner Cañete, asking or recommending that member states should go to 45% greenhouse gas emission reductions. So they should fulfill their renewables targets, their efficiency targets, but which will bring us to 45, which is, we know it, very far from what we need to become carbon neutral in 2050. And to come to the right frame, to be on track to follow that pathway. So that's a bit my sort of point of disappointment.
We can answer to any of these points in just a moment. So let's take some questions from the floor. Before individual questions, I want to put to you the same question I put to Leo earlier as well. So just raise your hands for one of these. So the question is really, do you trust politicians to solve climate crisis, or do you trust engineers? Hands up for politicians. Hands up for engineers. Okay.
Do you know what the problem with that is? I love engineers, but somebody has to go and persuade people this is a good idea, and that's not an engineer's job. Who's going to do that job? I mean, artists, brilliant. Writers, journalists, fantastic. As well as politicians, but you do need, it's the persuasion, the art of persuasion is very important here. It's not just, you can design a perfect energy system if people don't like it, a bit like you said with Macron, not that his was perfect, but he didn't really think through the politics of that.
Really?
I'm afraid so.
Questions, let's see, who's got a question for us? Gentleman here and then Adina. So just tell us who you are, where you're from, please. Yep, here you go.
Thanks. My name is Devin Sweezy. I work with Google on energy policy and regulation. My question sort of related to the politics versus engineering question is about the role of technology, and what types of technologies do you think are still needed to help reach this transition? Because one of the things that will make the politics easier is having technological options available and affordable to help make the transition. Obviously, renewables have come down in cost dramatically, but what other technologies do you think are needed to make this transition, and what's the role of policy in helping to stimulate the development of those technologies?
Thank you. Let's take that. Brent.
I can give a start. First of all, by saying that, when we are talking about technology, of course, we always have to keep in mind, to avoid some lock-in that we try to approach the policy areas often with this technologically neutral. Take now electrification of transport. issues, or how to reach decarbonization. So I mean, one has to be quite careful not to lock into one specific technology too early, even if in the end, I mean, hopefully then the market will prove what will be the leading technology. I mean, there are certain. I mean, it's depending on which sectors you are looking. And now, just from my experience, to give to kickstart to see some examples. I mean, certainly, if we are looking in the area of storages, a lot has to be done there. I mean, not only batteries for cars, but I mean, if we are serious with the decarbonization, means complete decarbonization of the electricity sector, we need to do much more to store. I mean, there you come to hydrogen technologies, I think, which has a huge potential in many areas. Power to X, often, of course, a sector coupling. I mean, these are all issues which hopefully will be tackled then also in the new commission. I think what is interesting, I mean, those who are a little bit familiar also with the New Horizon Europe, which puts a huge emphasis on climate energy. Among the 100 billion proposed, you propose even more. Unfortunately, we didn't. So far, we didn't get it. And there were a lot of emphasis also put on breakthrough technologies. I mean, often, of course, you know that the problem is then to and you in Google, you know it very well. I mean, then to develop it that it gets market mature, and I mean, there we are trying also with the Energy Innovation Council there to kickstart. So not to say from the scratch that we want to lead to say what is the right technology, but to give some incentives with engineers to develop. And you know, we have now this mission approach in the research area to say, I mean, this is where we want to go with the targets and help us to develop the technologies like storage.
Benedict.
I fully agree that the next round of technological revolution in the energy sector is going to be in the storage technology, and it's happening. It's already happening. It's not just a promise for the future, but it's happening. But I think that the revolution is much wider than simply the storage, and the big business in energy in the future is really energy management. And the big question will not be in the next couple of decades that who owns the energy sources, who has gas or oil, because with cheap renewable energy, I think there will be quite a lot of energy on the market. But the real question, how to control the electrical grids, how you can manage the energy flows, electricity and other energy flows in the systems. So I think that even from a business perspective, the big energy companies of the future will be in energy management, storage, demand-side management, and so on and so forth, much more than in owning energy resources. So the complete model of what we understand under energy companies is going to be changed. Okay. This will be much more about knowing more data, more information on the consumers, on the predictability of the weather, and so on and so forth. So it's computing capacity, information, and energy management.
Thank you. Molly.
I agree. I think that's right. I think we have to think about what technology we'll need in a very dynamic way. Again, coming back to what you said, you know, because as new things come on stream, we will have to move into new sectors, and also as we change the way we live, because it's also about a whole lifestyle change, then we will need different sorts of technology. So I think we shouldn't be trying to predict now what sort of technologies might be appropriate in 5 years' time. In fact, I can remember when I came to this Parliament 5 years ago, and I think the idea of phasing out fossil fuels was quite a new idea then, and now we're all saying, yeah, we'll be carbon neutral by 2050. So you can see how fast this is moving. I completely agree it's about energy storage and demand-supply management, and that's also advancing very rapidly. Also, there's the whole issue of the intermittency of renewables, or the other way of seeing that is, how do you use the energy from a wind turbine when you don't actually need the electricity, so at night? And the answer to that is you use it to not only to store it, but you can also use it to create hydrogen that you then hold there until somebody needs it for their car. So it's again about a lot of interactions. It's about a sort of whole ecosystem really of energy needs. And I think imagining that is one of the most important innovations that we need to make. And then there's also the sort of more soft technology of managing your demand and supply, managing people's movements so we can all share mobility rather than having to have our own cars. And of course, this also takes an awful lot of real-time computer power. And this brings us to you. And I think one of the things people think when they're using all their gadgets and so on, you see everybody on the train using their phones, they're thinking this is free, but of course it's not, because you're running massive servers. And so I think, again, coming back to the lock-in question, we don't want to create a whole load of very complex systems to manage energy that in themselves then become very demanding of energy. I'm sure you have your servers in Alaska or somewhere, but nonetheless, you know, we do need to keep that in mind, I think, so we're not just creating new demands for energy.
Okay. Do you want to answer your own question? Yeah.
I think it was a great holistic answer. Storage is going to be key. Demand-side management is going to be key, and I think it is going to require a lot of computing power to make all those technologies possible and all the integration.
Okay, thank you. Dina, I know you want to ask a question, but I want to ask you a question as well. AI for Earth, what is that?
AI for Earth is a program that was initiated by Microsoft to basically put the power of AI in the hands of researchers that know much more than us about climate solutions and innovation. So basically, it's researchers that have great ideas about how to solve and tackle climate challenges, have great data sets, but they just need the technology to, dive into those insights and really create actionable solutions out of that. So it's a program that has been started 2 years ago, and it's going to run in the next 5 years as well, and it's open to researchers and scientists.
Okay, so this will help create the actionable intelligence we were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Absolutely, it's one of the ways.
Okay.
I guess
You had a question?
to do that. My question is really about the role of corporates in the energy transition. You talked a lot about investment and where the investments are coming from in terms of achieving the targets, both at EU level and at member state level. And there are a lot of corporations now that have also, incredible targets for their own energy consumption, and they want to invest in renewable energy to achieve those targets. But the reality is that in some countries it's easier to do it than in others. There are still a lot of barriers towards the corporate sourcing of renewable energy, and the Commission has done a great job in the Renewable Energy Directive to actually encourage more corporate participation in corporate sourcing of renewable energy. But looking at the national climate and energy plans, there were no kind of concrete plans to remove those barriers to corporate sourcing. So my question is, maybe for Bernd and others, what would be your feedback to the member states in terms of how to actually remove those barriers and encourage corporates to invest more and support countries to achieve their renewable energy targets, because we want to play our part in that.
Okay, I want to put this to Victoria, then Bernd.
Maybe I just start on that. Yes, I fully agree with everything that you said, and just to make again the point that corporate power purchase agreements, or PPAs, they have been really booming in the last 2 years. We are now at more than 5 gigawatts. Signed contracts with solar and also with wind. Wind energy is definitely leading the way in there, because we have the bulk of it. It's 4.7 gigawatts signed with different corporations. But as you rightly mentioned, in the national energy and climate plans, we actually have seen almost nothing on how you do remove regulatory barriers for such power purchase agreements. And this is an explicit requirement from the Renewable Energy Directive. We were very disappointed with this because we have seen in some member states, like for instance in Romania and Bulgaria, there were even forbidden by law. So by law you couldn't actually sign even such agreements. So it's been really very difficult also for us to go and talk to governments and explain to them that this is really a great model in which you can incentivize further uptake of renewable energy. And our feedback has, of course, been that now that the Commission is doing the recommendations on the national plans, they should very clearly underline in there that all of the member states, apart from Romania, need to really fill in that box, because no one mentioned anything on this, and
Why
it's
though?
quite...
Why is
Sorry?
not mention anything?
I think on the one hand, it's still maybe raising awareness just in general about what corporate power purchase agreements are, how you can actually do it on the ground. It's also to show the examples to member states that maybe are not so ambitious on renewables, on how exactly you can do them. But it's also in general just to look a little bit on the regulatory frameworks and make sure that you're allowing different models, different business models to actually be activated, and not just the traditional ones that we have seen.
Do you think it's a lack of understanding or lack of awareness?
Maybe both, to a certain extent. I think it depends a little bit on the countries where we're talking about, but now we see certain positive movements. As I mentioned previously, we have been working quite a lot on Romania and Bulgaria on these topics, because that's where really there was clear regulatory barrier to go into that direction. So when you go to the government and you talk to them with examples from other member states of how this has been done and how this is achieving also climate and energy climates, they have proceeded with amendments to the national regulatory framework, and this is very positive.
Okay, Brian, quick answer on this, then I want to do another question.
Yes, John, maybe first concretely on the role of corporate, and then this gives me the opportunity to say a few words on
Sure.
today's recommendations, also to put it a little bit in the context, if you allow. I mean, first of all, I wanted to confirm indeed this was one of our objectives in the Renewable Directive 2, and in the whole clean energy package, exactly to empower consumers in a broader sense, turning them into prosumers, and to have corporate much more participating. So encouraging them. This has also to do with electricity market design. I mean, you have to change the mechanisms, how it works, into more short-term trading, decentralization. So I mean, we've been exactly aiming at encouraging this. I mean, this is fairly new. You know, it's a directive transposition. So I mean, we cannot immediately now do the blaming and shaming. So we'll have to give the member states a little bit some time, which leads me to the national energy and climate plans. Just to stress that these plans are aimed, or member states are obliged to set out their policies for the coming 10 years, so from 2021 until 2030, how they want to contribute to achieving the 2030 targets, and keeping in mind that for energy efficiency and renewables, as you know, there's not a binding EU target. There's not a binding target for member states. So you might risk that in the end, if you add up everything, we will not come to the 32 and 32.5 thanks to the Parliament. It was increased. So the whole aim, and I would almost say it's almost revolutionary, because I remember at the beginning when we came with these ideas of governance, many people were discouraging us. You are not going to achieve it. Member states will not accept any legislation on this. But where we are now, so because I hear a little bit, if I may say so, impatience and criticism, which I well understand. Why didn't we do more naming and shaming? Where are we now? We received so far only, if I may so, draft plans. So the member states are obliged to submit their final plans by the end of this year. And so today's exercise and also the press conference was to send to member states our first analysis. It's not the final analysis, and indeed I fully agree. I mean, looking at them at some of the plans, they are not complete at all. One has to acknowledge it was an enormous exercise, because it's not only about energy. You have to involve so many ministers. It's very complex. So I'm sure that by the end of the year, or beginning of 2020, we would come with a much more detailed analysis, where we would address the so-called ambition gaps, because now it's about the ambition. And then later on in the process, because it's about 10 years, we will see that there might be some delivery gaps. And I mean, if I'm looking at today, just to give one figure, if you look at, it's now not about renewables. I mean, there was a 2% gap, but energy efficiency is a much bigger problem, 6%. So there's a lot of work to do, and there I'm sure we would go much more into detail.
Just I want to close on this particular subject with the idea we see that there's a lack of understanding or lack of direction perhaps as well. Can the Commission really afford to wait to see implementation in 10 years' time, given the timeline of 11, 12 years for the 1.5 degrees? Is the Commission convinced that it's doing enough, not just to demand elements from member states, but that it's educating enough?
Not with Commissioner Cañete asking, looking us into 45%. So that's
no, but is there an instruction element missing here as well? You know, can you really wait 6 months to have another review and then another 6 months to see if that review has been implemented? Should the Commission be more on the ground, assisting particularly weaker member states in implementing and even going through the process of implementation?
First of all, I want to say, I mean, we're talking about reaching 2030 targets.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, understandably, I mean, member states will need some time to get there. There's a trajectory development. I mean,
But
so
in
you
terms
can't-
of their planning, though.
So you can't expect the planning is they're obliged by the end of this year to come with a final plan, and I'm sure a lot of work will be invested into it. But then you will have to give them some time. And of course, there are also some regional disparities. I didn't know that in the region you are coming from, that it's the best for solar. So
Only the brightest.
Come on holiday to Cornwall.
with pleasure. So of course there are, I mean, on the one hand you have ambition gaps, but also delivery gaps where you can play a little bit with compensating, helping member states to member states, also by incentivizing with instruments. But I'm sure also with the new impetus, with the new strategic agenda, there will be much more pressure on member states. And I mean, this is my personal view. Also, when we are now heading towards, I mean, UN 2050 decarbonisation, that we will go beyond. I mean, one thing is prescriptive regulation. The other thing is, I mean, we're talking a lot about technology. I mean, it's amazing where we're heading, not only about prices, but what is achievable. And I'm sure that this will help us to
We've also
do
got this
properly.
race to the top now, right? Because we've got Finland here, 2035.
Yeah.
You know, we've got to push countries, and then the Commission will get left behind, and they'll have to catch up. And so that feels quite positive now.
No, there's indeed, that's really interesting. And there's this, for the summit, which is coming up now next Thursday, Friday, there's been a really huge mobilization, I think, of member states that we've seen growing over the past weeks, and really building up to something which can make a difference. So this is heads of state are supposed to talk about 2050 decarbonisation targets this Thursday and Friday. And there's been an alliance from 8, starting with 8 countries, and we're growing up to 18 or 20 countries now. Finland coming out last week or 2 weeks ago with his 2035 decarbonisation target. So that's really interesting things
What's
happening.
the driver for this? What's pushing this so quickly?
Green votes, I think you'll find.
It's 10 years to act.
Do you think it's green votes or 10 years to act? Do people
Both,
see this?
both.
Okay.
And it's
And
mobilisation
it's young
on
people,
the street,
young
leading
people
to
on the
green
street.
votes.
This is incredible.
You mean democracy is actually working?
It seems to be working in this area.
And young women, mainly. Mainly.
And
Maybe.
older women.
And older.
A new lexicon. Gentlemen here, and then at the back here as well, please. We have 5 minutes left, so let's short questions and we'll get short answers from our panel.
Thanks. So I don't introduce myself. My question is about the growth, the growth, and I hope it's not out of the radar. Do you think that could be part of the solution, and or is something that is too much idealist? And if it's not part of the solution, can be considered kind of a side effect from a greener economy, and how policy can help towards the growth.
Okay,
Thanks.
just and then a question here as well. Put this together.
Hey, I'm Julius Werner. I'm a VW policy intern. Just a short question of the real-world implications of the deployment
We
for
don't read the real
renewables.
world here.
Just because some member states have had great success deploying the technology and some haven't, but we kind of still need a lot of faster deployment to reach the 2050 climate goals at least. So the question here really is: can we already afford to go full neutral on energy, or do we still need gas or even nuclear power to get rid of coal first, just to solve our climate issues, and then go fully renewable later because we have the resources? And maybe there's a little second thing. Europe can only offer 15% of the solution globally at most. Is there any way of bringing other big players to the table, like the growing markets or the Americans, to help us with our efforts?
Thank you. It's kind of tied together. Let's go Benedict first, then Molly.
Yeah, starting with the first question, or the second question, I believe that there is no other way to go really in a financially effective and efficient way carbon neutral by 2050 than with renewables. And nuclear is absolutely out of question. I think that nuclear is dead because of economic. It's because of economic considerations, and it's not anymore the green concerns, but because it's so much more expensive than any other way of energy generation that it's really cannot be a part of an effective decarbonization path, I believe. Perhaps in some specific cases, like in China and India, when they really have to go carbon neutral in a very short period of time, where they have still a huge amount of coal, perhaps, and they have money, perhaps they can use some nuclear. But in Europe, I think that the only way is go to a fully renewable-based energy system as soon as possible, and this is in real life what can take us to decarbonization by 2050.
Okay, thank you. Molly.
This is right. I mean, renewables are faster and cheaper than any alternative, and nuclear is incredibly slow and very expensive. On your question on China and the US and so on, it's absolutely essential that we introduce a carbon price floor and we make it look like that. So it's clear to industry that the price of using any fossil energy is going to increase, and I'm afraid I don't think the ETS system is strong enough to do that. Then how do we make sure that that doesn't destroy our own heavy energy industries? We introduce a tax on goods coming into our market from countries that aren't living up to our standards. As a big market, we will have the power then to influence what happens in other countries. And on your degrowth question, I'm 100% with you here. I think we need to focus much more on the quality of the economy and stop obsessing on the quantity of it, because an awful lot of what we measure is either destructive, like accidents or gambling in financial circuits, rather than actually providing anything good. And when you focus on growth, you encourage things like death data in built-in obsolescence of products rather than the circular economy, for example. You also encourage an advertising industry that stresses people out with the constant consumption, which I don't think is actually making anybody happy. Or maybe that's just me, but I don't like shopping. And I think we need to think a lot more. We need to redefine what a good life is all about. You know, the Greeks asked that question. It's a wonderful cultural question, and I think we should focus on that more rather than getting more stuff. What makes us happy?
Oh, but degrowth and tax revenue, they're not compatible, are they?
Yeah, I think, well, so I agree with what Benedict said about tax. Tax isn't primarily about getting money, it's about changing behaviour. And if you want, we also control the banks, so we shouldn't think about tax as necessarily the only way of getting money. And if the economy shrinks, there will be less money available through tax. But on the other hand, we can control the money supply to make that up. And we will be taxing, we will certainly be introducing taxes that, as the economy becomes more sustainable, they will reduce. For example, a kerosene tax, if we see aviation reducing, as we need to, then we will be getting less revenue. We don't have that tax yet, but we will.
Okay.
Soon, I hope.
I just want to ask a quick final remark, a really short final remark from each of you. Worth bearing in mind, of course, that the Greens are in the middle of negotiations to set the plan for the next 5 years here at the moment. So just to wrap up, in 30 seconds each, as you can see the clock's running out, what needs to be done next? And I don't want you to cover anything else that you've said already. What needs to be done next for Europe to become climate neutral by 2050? Esther?
Phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, we mentioned it in the beginning, but I think that's
most important thing.
We didn't insist so much on that, and for me, I think that's part of the bigger investment question, and getting rid of one technology, going to the next one.
Thank you, Bernd.
Yeah, for me the priorities are clearly in the coming years huge investments into innovation, research. This will help us to achieve climate neutrality. Just wanted to say within the 30 seconds word of caution that of course we have to think also about the magic triangle. So we are talking about sustainability, very important, will be even more important, but it's also about affordability, and it's also about energy security. So if we are looking at the medium term, we should keep the decarbonization agenda and goal in mind. But in terms of energy mix, I'd be less optimistic. I mean, when you are saying a quick phase out of fossil fuels, this will not be. I mean, at least when we are talking about natural gas, LNG, not so quickly going. If you like it or not, if you look also at our decarbonization scenarios, the 8 options, there's, I think that it's the color orange. You will find the nuclear. It's not a political statement, but if you try to add up, it might play a role.
Thank you, Mo.
I've already done mine. I'm going to go for the carbon price floor, minimum carbon price that increases in a predictable way with a border adjustment tariff.
You think that's such a clear perspective that it will shift the market quickly?
That will provide the incentive on every single thing that happens here and every single thing we import as well. So everything that happens in the European economy will be affected by that incentive. It's a fundamental incentive. It'll change the way the economy works.
Thank you.
We need to do it tomorrow.
On my side, I think we need to bear in mind that 2030 is the stepping stone to 2050, so we are not going to get there if we don't get 2030 right. National plans, chronologically speaking, are the biggest, most important challenge in the immediate term. And then as we go towards the new commission, I think from our perspective it would be the need for a very clear industrial strategy for renewables and our place in the world, with clear also investments going into research and innovation. And also one thing which we didn't have the time to bring in here, but it's also important, how do we ensure that there is also cohesion between our climate and energy policies, but also the European trade policies and our place in the world?
Thank you. The last 30 seconds are yours, Benedict.
Perhaps the most important experience I had in the last 5 years while negotiating also the clean energy package, that energy is not just one of the products on the market. It's a strategic product, and it's always, and it was always, and it will be always a highly politicized issue. And what I experienced, that most of the problems are not technological, which we face with when trying to carry out the energy transition. It's not technological, it's not business, it's not money, it's political. So I think that the most important thing to tear down the political walls and barriers ahead of the energy transition in Europe with the member state governments and also outside Europe.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. And also thank you to John Frank and the Microsoft team and the Euractiv team who are hovering about here, and to our audiovisual crew as well. It remains me to thank all of you for participating tonight and to invite you to join us for drinks outside. Good evening.